It didn't happen in Washington. It didn't happen on Wall Street. It happened in the ice. While microphones screamed and tariffs were weaponized, something else moved quiet, surgical, unstoppable. Canada didn't shout back. Canada didn't threaten. Canada left. Here's the paradox that should stop you cold. The United States raised pressure. Canada lost nothing. And $780 billion in trade began to reroute silently. This isn't a trade story. It just pretends to be one. On paper, this looks like another tariff fight. Another headline. Another market shrug. But beneath the noise, a structural shift snapped into place. One that doesn't reverse with a speech. One that doesn't care who wins the next election. While Washington tried to pull the plug, Ottawa rewired the circuit. You can hear the contrast if you listen closely. On one side, threats, deadlines, volume. On the other, silence, permits, concrete, steel. The kind of silence that kills leverage. Because leverage only works if the other side has nowhere to go. Canada found a way out, and it didn't run south. It ran north, past the border drama, past the choke points, past the old assumptions baked into decades of American infrastructure dominance. It ran into the Arctic, into a port most people forgot existed. A port once sold for $1. A port buried under snow and neglect. That port is awake now. This is the first hint of the ghost train. You don't hear it because it doesn't use horns. You feel it when routes disappear from your maps. Here's the promise of this saga. We're going to show you how a single question asked without emotion turned tariff threats into a checkmate. How pressure didn't force submission, it forced independence. And how the loudest bully on the board watched his leverage bleed out one shipment at a time. So ask yourself this before we go any further. If power follows the routes goods travel, what happens when those routes move? The noise came first. Loud, crude, public. Tariffs were weaponized like blunt objects. Threats were hurled across microphones with one message baked into every syllable. We control the tap. Canadian fertilizer. Canadian grain. Bow down or pay up. The math looked intimidating at first. More than 90% of the potash used by American farmers comes from Canada. Strip that supply. Jack up the price. Force obedience. That was the play. A classic zero-sum move built on an old assumption. If the United States tightens the screws, Canada has nowhere else to go. That assumption was wrong. But before it was exposed, the pain landed where it always does, at home. American farmers felt it first, not in theory, in invoices. Potash is not optional. It is the backbone of industrial agriculture. You don't wait out fertilizer. You apply it or you lose the season. So when tariff threats started bouncing through markets, prices twitched. Then they jumped. Planning froze. Co-ops scrambled. The cost of planting crept upward, and no speech from Washington could make the numbers behave. This is the part no one likes to talk about. Tariffs don't punish abstractions. They punish timelines. They punish margins. They punish people who can't reroute fast enough. And in this case, the United States was threatening a supply it could not replace. Domestic production wasn't ready. Alternatives were scarce. The leverage was supposed to be decisive. Instead, it was self-harm. Here's where the betrayal sets in, not political, but strategic. While Washington cranked up the volume, Canada did something unnerving. It went quiet. No counter tariffs, no press theatrics, no late-night calls begging for exemptions, just silence. The kind that unnerves negotiators because it means the other side isn't playing the same game. That silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation, because every threat carries information. And what Canada learned, fast, was this. Volatility had become policy. Access could be questioned on a whim. Infrastructure that looked stable yesterday could be turned into a bargaining chip tomorrow. For a country that ships its lifeblood across borders, that is not a nuisance. It is a risk profile. Risk profiles trigger behavior. Capital hates surprises. Supply chains hate mood swings. And when uncertainty starts behaving like a tax paid every quarter, on every shipment, people stop arguing ideology and start counting exits. This is the unintended consequence loop in motion. The harder the pressure, the more valuable the alternative. The louder the threat, the faster someone asks the forbidden question. Why are we dependent at all? Washington thought it was tightening control. In reality, it was teaching a lesson in escape velocity. And here's the cruel irony. The threats didn't even need to be implemented. The possibility was enough. Investment decisions don't wait for laws to pass. They react to tone, to trajectory, to the sense that tomorrow might be worse than today. Factories don't like gambling with policy roulette. So while the microphones kept roaring, the real damage was happening off camera. Boardrooms paused. Logistics teams ran scenarios. Governments stopped asking how to win the argument and started asking how to survive the next one. From the outside, it still looked like dominance. Canada wasn't pushing back. Canada wasn't escalating. Commentators mistook restraint for submission. They missed the pivot, because this was the moment Canada stopped trying to manage the bully and started planning life without him. The moment where dependence stopped being normal and started looking dangerous. The moment when tariffs ceased to be a threat and became a signal. A signal that said, this relationship can be pulled apart at any time. And once that signal is received, there is no going back to business as usual. Washington celebrated the noise. Ottawa studied the exits. What came next wasn't retaliation. It was replacement. And by the time the United States realized the silence wasn't fear, the first doors were already closing behind Canada quietly, permanently, without a single shot fired. This is where the story turns cold. Not loud. Not emotional. Technical. While Washington kept shouting into microphones, Canada stopped listening. It went gray rock. Flat affect. No reaction. Because once you accept that volatility is permanent, you stop arguing with it. You route around it. And that's when Mark Carney asked the question that detonated everything. Not in a rally. Not on television. In a room full of planners. Why are we shipping Canadian fertilizer through American ports? When Canada has its own Arctic gateway, the room went quiet for a reason. Everyone knew the answer, and everyone knew it was humiliating. Canada grows the wheat. Canada mines the potash. Saskatchewan alone sits on 1.1 billion tons of underground reserves. Canada controls 41% of global potash exports, worth $5.5 billion every year. And yet, for decades, Canadian cargo had been marching south first, across American rail lines, through American ports, paying American fees at every checkpoint, a legacy route, comfortable, familiar, and suddenly dangerous. That was the blind spot Trump never saw. He thought control came from owning the gate. He didn't notice Canada owned the land behind it. So Canada stopped debating tariffs and started redesigning maps. On March 7th, 2025, Genesis Fertilizers made the move public, a partnership with Arctic Gateway Group. The plan was precise. Import 300,000 tons of phosphate annually through the Port of Churchill. Produce finished fertilizer, export it the same way, north, out, gone. No American ports. No American rail choke points. No permission required. Most Americans had never heard of Churchill. Many Canadians had forgotten it existed. A small port on Hudson Bay, built in the 1930s as a northern gateway to Europe. Deep water, rail-connected, perfectly positioned to slash thousands of kilometers off Atlantic routes. And then abandoned. Sold in the 1990s for $1 because Ottawa once believed it had no strategic value. When flooding damaged the rail line in 2017, the private American owner walked away. The port went dark. The line went silent. Everyone assumed the story was over. Trump's tariff threats resurrected it. This is the rule Washington forgot. Infrastructure creates behavior. Once you build supply chains around a route, they don't politely revert. They harden. They optimize. They defend themselves. Genesis isn't building a side project. It's planning a facility capable of producing 1 million tons of fertilizer annually. That means year after year of cargo moving through Churchill instead of the United States. And Genesis is just the opening act. Saskatchewan's fertilizer sector moves billions every year. If one company proves the northern route works, others follow. Why keep paying American logistics firms when you can own the chain end to end? Why gamble on political moods when ice and steel don't tweet? This is the ghost train in full motion. You don't see it because it doesn't announce itself. It just reroutes mass quietly. One contract, one terminal, one rail upgrade at a time. By the time anyone in Washington thinks to object, the behavior has already changed. And here's the part that makes it lethal. Once companies restructure operations around Churchill, they do not pivot back because a tariff threat cools off. New elevators get built. New storage comes online. New delivery schedules lock in. European buyers adjust their logistics. 6 days get shaved off delivery times compared to Vancouver. Costs drop. Reliability improves. No ideology required. Just math. Canada didn't retaliate. Canada didn't escalate. Canada replaced. Trump believed pressure would force submission. Instead, it forced an upgrade. And upgrades don't reverse. They obsolete what came before. By the time Washington realized what was happening, the leverage wasn't being challenged. It was being bypassed. And once leverage is bypassed, it doesn't matter how loudly you threaten to pull the plug. The system has already learned how to live without you. This is where the wait sets in. Because once the first route works, the rest don't stay theoretical. They line up, they wait, and then they move. What began with fertilizer doesn't end with fertilizer. Grain is next. Canada ships roughly 27 to 29 million tons of grain every year. For decades, most of it squeezed through Vancouver's congested terminals or detoured through American infrastructure. Expensive, slow, politically exposed, normal until it wasn't. Churchill changes the math. From Hudson Bay, Canadian grain reaches European buyers roughly 6 days faster than shipments routed through Vancouver. 6 days is not a rounding error. In commodities, 6 days is leverage. It means better pricing windows, tighter inventory control, fewer penalties, and once buyers adjust to that rhythm, they don't volunteer to go back. Ottawa understood what that meant. So the silence broke, not with rhetoric, but with funding. The Canadian government committed $180 million over 5 years to rebuild the Arctic corridor. Grain handling systems, expanded storage, modern loading equipment, icebreaker support to stretch the shipping season, not speeches. Steel. This is how a structural shift announces itself. Because when infrastructure upgrades stack, behavior follows. Fertilizer moves north, grain follows. Then come the conversations no one in Washington wants to have out loud. Critical minerals from northern deposits, potash from new mines. Even energy once unthinkable through the Arctic starts entering feasibility models. Not tomorrow, not hypothetically, on spreadsheets, in planning documents. Right now. And here's the brutal part. The United States can't stop any of it. Canada isn't breaking trade agreements. It isn't closing markets. It isn't imposing retaliatory tariffs. It is simply investing in its own territory and choosing to use it. Completely legal. Completely sovereign. Completely outside Washington's reach. This is the hysteresis effect at work. Once supply chains shift, they don't snap back when pressure eases. New rail schedules lock in. Storage facilities anchor capital. Training pipelines develop. Local economies reorganize. Reversing course doesn't just feel inconvenient, it feels suicidal. That's why leverage diluted this way never returns. Washington can threaten again. It won't matter. The incentive structure has already changed. Every new tariff threat now reinforces the same lesson. Diversification is cheaper than dependence. Every spike in rhetoric sends more planners north to the map, with Hudson Bay circled in red. And then comes the number that makes Washington go quiet. Over a decade, conservative projections put $700 to $800 billion in trade rerouted through Canadian-controlled infrastructure, cargo that once paid American ports, American railways, American logistics firms, gone. Not destroyed. Not sanctioned. Just not there anymore. This is the kind of loss that doesn't trigger alarms. There's no single bill to vote on, no treaty to tear up. Just revenue that fails to appear, fees that dry up, influence that fades without a headline, and the template spreads. Other governments are watching this closely, not because they want to copy Canada line for line, but because they want proof that escape doesn't equal collapse, that you can reduce exposure to a volatile partner without detonating your own economy. Canada just provided that proof, not by confronting power, but by outgrowing it. Trump believed dominance lived in volume, in threats, in the ability to scare allies into line. What he underestimated was endurance, the patience to build alternatives quietly, the discipline to let noise burn itself out while concrete sets. This is the new world taking shape. Power that doesn't shout, leverage that doesn't threaten, control exercised through roots, not rhetoric. And once the roots move, the empire doesn't fall. It just finds itself standing in front of an empty gate, wondering when the traffic stopped. Empires don't collapse with explosions. They collapse with reroutes. Donald Trump wanted leverage. He wanted obedience. He wanted to prove that pressure still worked, that tariffs could scare allies back into line, that infrastructure was destiny, that the gate belonged to Washington. Instead, the gate stayed open, and nothing came through. Canada didn't retaliate. Canada didn't grandstand. Canada walked away. This is the boomerang effect, fully realized. Every tariff threat was supposed to tighten control. Every insult was meant to remind Canada who held the cards. Instead, Each one accelerated the same outcome: independence by design. Look at what can't be undone. Factories are planned around new routes. Grain elevators rise along northern corridors. Rail schedules lock in. Ports that once slept now hum through Arctic nights. These aren't policies. They're commitments. Concrete, steel, capital sunk for decades. No election reverses them. No press conference pulls them back. Once the system learns to live without you, it doesn't unlearn the habit. This is the checkmate Trump never saw coming. Because checkmate doesn't require confrontation. It only requires that every future move becomes worse than doing nothing. Washington can threaten again. It won't matter. The leverage has already bled out of the system. The United States still has ports. It still has rails. It still has markets. What it doesn't have anymore is inevitability. For generations, American infrastructure dominance was assumed. Canadian dependency was treated as permanent. Those assumptions were never laws of nature. They were habits, and habits break quietly when better options appear. Canada didn't defect. Canada didn't rebel. Canada matured. It treated volatility like what it is, a liability. It stopped arguing with the storm and reinforced the building. It built redundancy. It bought insurance. And once you're insured, threats sound different, distant, manageable, almost irrelevant. That's the lesson echoing far beyond Hudson Bay. Other governments are watching this unfold. They aren't cheering. They're studying. They see that diversification doesn't have to mean chaos, that you can reduce exposure without lighting yourself on fire. That shouting is optional when you can simply reroute. This is how power moves in the modern world. Not with ultimatums, not with flags, but with logistics. Capital doesn't care about speeches. It cares about predictability. And right now, predictability is the scarcest currency on Earth.